Hello everyone, this is Here's Trivia, and welcome back to the final episode of the Reign of Cao Rui Let's Talk Lore series as we conclude with episode 8, titled Cao Rui's Legacy. Now last episode we touched on Cao Rui's personal life by focusing on his wives and sons, and before we dive into Cao Rui's political legacy for our final episode here, there are a few other personal issues that I want to touch on. First, aside from collecting concubines, Cao Rui was also most likely bisexual. There are a few historical accounts of Cao Rui's close relationship with Cao Xiu's eldest son, Cao Zhao, who is described historically as exceedingly handsome. And there are also documentations of Cao Zhao spending the night together with Cao Rui on multiple occasions, as the pair of them would often play games where the wager would be each other's clothing, akin to strip poker. And for those who have watched the TV series Advisor Alliance, which is where the cover art for this series comes from, the eunuch character in the show is historically modeled after Cao Zhao. Furthermore, even the depictions of Cao Rui cross-dressing in the show is also historically correct, as Cao Rui did have a thing for silky robes in the female style, and even changed the jade beads usually adorned on the emperor's headpiece to coral beads to add a more feminine touch. Cao Rui was also recorded to have been fascinated with He Yan's skin, which was described in history as smooth, beautiful, and pale, and Cao Rui went as far as inviting He Yan to eat a hot bowl of soup noodles during the summer month just to confirm that he did not use makeup, as He Yan started to sweat profusely after such a meal in the hot summer heat. Now, the main reason I'm sharing these stories is not to make a big deal about Cao Rui's sexuality. Humans of all cultures and ethnicity has always had a wide spectrum of sexuality throughout history. What we see today in a much more open society is a fair reflection of what you should expect in history, as the only thing that has changed over time is the society's acceptance of such things. Regardless, the key information from these stories is that Cao Rui was extremely close with Cao Xiu's son Cao Zhao, and actually wanted to name him as one of his co-regents for his adopted son and heir Cao Feng. But for reasons that we'll discuss at the end of this episode, it did not happen. Now, aside from Cao Rui's sexuality, his humanity should also be highlighted, as Cao Rui was one of the few emperors to actually care about his citizens. Cao Rui was recorded to have farmed in the fields in order to experience what life was like for a farmer. Cao Rui also had local governments distribute coats, firewood, and food to all senior citizens who did not have kids to take care of them during the winter season multiple times during his reign to help the most vulnerable get through the toughest time of the year. Cao Rui's childhood interest in criminal code also paid off, as he, alongside Chen Qun, continued to reform the penal codes as they reduced the severity of punishments for many crimes where they deemed it to be too excessive. Cao Rui also liked to attend public trials to see if the judgments were fair, and more importantly, to let the people know that the emperor, and thus the court, supported fair trials. Overall, Cao Rui was quite a capable emperor, especially if you consider the fact that he inherited the throne at a relatively young age where he was given 4 co-regents, yet he never allowed his regents to overpower him, but rather was able to utilize them fully for their individual strength. And speaking of regents, we need to end our series by talking about Cao Rui's final days and how he ended up picking the pair of co-regents in Cao Shuang and Sima Yi. So we know Cao Rui started to feel unwell around December 8th, 238. Then by December 24th, Cao Rui probably came to the realization himself that he might not make it, as he made several key appointments that day. First, his favorite concubine, Lady Guo, was named as Empress, which was a position that had been vacant for almost 2 years ever since he sentenced the previous Empress, Empress Mao, to death in 237. Then he awarded the Grand General position to his uncle Cao Yu. Now, Cao Yu was the son of Cao Cao and Lady Huan. His more famous older brother is none other than the child prodigy Cao Chong. And when Cao Rui was young, Cao Yu was his favorite uncle. So when Cao Rui became emperor, Cao Yu got the title as Prince of Yan in 232. Then in 235, Cao Yu got the rare chance to get a court appointment and move to the capital, as even though Cao Rui did soften some of the rules set forth by his father Cao Pi in terms of restricting the powers of the princedoms, it was still a rarity that a prince can leave their title land and find themselves an imperial court position. Then 2 years later, Cao Yu would be reassigned to Ye, where he would stay until he was suddenly summoned back to Luoyang, as Cao Rui felt his health was slipping away. The intention here was to elevate his favorite uncle Cao Yu as the Grand General and the regent for his adopted son and heir Cao Feng. But shockingly, Cao Yu would turn Cao Rui down on the grounds that Cao Pi had laid strict rules at the founding of the dynasty that forbid exactly this. And on top of that, Cao Yu had a personality that he felt wasn't right for the job. Now, in addition to Cao Yu's appointment, Cao Rui also wanted Xiahou Xian, Cao Shuang, Cao Zhao, and Qin Lang as co-regents as well. And these four were all second generation or third generation youngsters without much merit and were personally close to Cao Rui. Xiahou Xian is the grandson of Xiahou Dun, and the only position he has served so far is the general in charge of the palace guards. Cao Shuang is the famously fat son of Cao Zhen, who up until this point had only hung out in the palace befriending Cao Rui. Cao Zhao, who we mentioned before, is Cao Xiu's eldest son, who is historically known for his beauty and close relationship with Cao Rui. And finally, we have Qin Lang, who is a stepson of Cao Cao from his marriage to Qin Yulu's wife, Lady Du, who Guan Yu had wanted before the Battle of Xiapi. Now, Qin Lang had no talent and was not used during Cao Cao or Cao Pi's reign, but he was close to Cao Rui, who liked to keep him around as an attendant because Cao Rui liked how low-key Qin Lang was and how Qin Lang never spoke up against any of Cao Rui's vices. And Qin Lang's most famous historical feat was his ability to take bribes from officials who wanted him to pass messages to Cao Rui. But after accepting the money, Qin Lang would never pass the message. So Qin Lang ended up extremely wealthy while also not upsetting Cao Rui, who ended up appreciating his low-key personality. But in short, this list of appointments had zero merits, as Cao Rui simply wanted to pick people he liked and trusted. However, his two senior imperial court secretaries, in Liu Fang and Sun Zi, disliked this selection very much, as they would voice their dissent to Cao Rui. Now, even though Liu Fang and Sun Zi's position is called secretary, they are probably the most experienced members of the court by this point, as both of them have been serving as the court secretary ever since Cao Cao was prime minister. And Liu Fang, in particular, was a very skilled writer when it came to writing edicts and law, and many of the edicts passed by Cao Cao, Cao Pi, and Cao Rui had all been actually written by him and then signed off by the emperor. So these are no regular secretaries, but key members of the court and held immense power. And because of their seniority, they didn't get along with the youngsters like Cao Zhao and Xiahou Xian, who they saw as meritless second or third generation brats living off the achievements of their forefathers. And word's already gotten out that if Cao Zhao and Xiahou Xian becomes regents, then they will move to replace the likes of Liu Fang and Sun Zi. So there was definitely a bit of self-preservation involved when Liu Fang and Sun Zi managed to convince Cao Rui that since Cao Yu had turned down the appointment as Grand General, it was probably best to reconsider the rest of the co-regent selection, as without someone senior like Cao Yu, the other four are simply too young to handle this task. So when Cao Rui asked them who they had in mind, Liu Fang and Sun Zi looked around the room and noticed that Cao Shuang was also present, so they ended up nominating Cao Shuang to take on the task of Grand General in Cao Yu's place, and suggested that Sima Yi, who was the Grand Commandant at the time, should be recalled back from the north to provide an experienced voice and hand to help guide Cao Shuang as co-regents. Thinking it over, Cao Rui was a bit hesitant at first, not because of Sima Yi's appointment, but because he was not sure if Cao Shuang was up to the task as Grand General. But as he was pondering this aloud, Liu Fang, Sun Zi, and Cao Shuang all affirmed that Cao Shuang was up to the task, as the decision was finally made, and the edict went out on December 27th that Cao Shuang would become the Grand General instead of Cao Yu, and the positions that Cao Rui had previously planned for the likes of Xiahou Xian, Cao Zhao, and Qin Lang were all voided as well. In addition, Sima Yi, who was at the time resting his army in Henei after the Liaodong campaign against the Gongsun clan, was summoned back to the capital to receive his co-regent position alongside Cao Shuang. And even with Sima Yi rushing back to the capital as quickly as possible, it would take nearly a month, as Sima Yi barely made it in time to see Cao Rui one last time on January 22nd, 239, to officially receive his co-regent position in person before Cao Rui would die later that night, as the Wei dynasty officially said goodbye to its second emperor and welcome in its third in Cao Feng, who was but 8 years old at this time. And with this, our episode and series comes to an end as well, as we'll return in the future to cover the life of Sima Yi, as I want to just state that even up until this point, Sima Yi did not have any plans of usurping Wei, and it would be the political clashes that Sima Yi would have with his fellow co-regent Cao Shuang, and the general differences between this younger generation of Wei officials and that of the more senior ones such as Sima Yi, that would end up pushing Sima Yi to launch his coup, mainly as a means to eliminate Cao Shuang, and not to usurp the Wei throne. It is just that after Cao Shuang's elimination, and with Cao Feng so young, the Sima clan essentially had all the power, much like how Cao Cao controlled the Han court. And once you get all that power, you are never going to let it go. So hopefully as we end things here, all of you have enjoyed this series enough to hit that like button to help support the channel, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!